father of the movement. He is clearly the goal. There is the intentional structures of mental acts as they are directed at both real and ideal objects. That's in his work, Local Investigations. So, Martin Heidegger was an assistant to Husserl, and he both criticized and expanded on Husserl's phenomenological thought in his work, Being and Time. That's something that we've looked at in class. And so Martin saw human beings in relation to other beings, and at the same time, because of that view, he developed his theory of design, which is the human being engaged in the world. Please pardon my pronunciations if they're a little off. And that's something we also looked at, the theory of design. So because Heidegger views quite different. I mean, it was different in that sense, in that he had rejected Husserl's acceptance of an ego filled with ideas about the world. It's not just an ego and then an object, and the ego is transcending the object, or transcends the meaning, or the meaning is coming from the ego. Rather, Martin Heidegger took phenomenology as a metaphysical ontology and not as a foundational philosophical discipline. And this is also because important thing I forgot to mention is that Martin Heidegger was a French existentialist. Or I'm sorry, not a French existentialist, but he was German, and he had developed his ideas and thoughts towards what is termed existential phenomenology. And his existentialism influenced phenomenology because existentialists essentially are philosophers who believe that being has a moral dimension. And so there is this understanding that there's a dimension of consciousness, there is a dimension of morality. There are all these dimensions that have to relate and contribute to the understanding of the human being. And this human being, primarily in Martin's view, is not alone. This is a being that is a being for. It is a being in the world. It is a being that is engaged in the world. Other than Husserl and Heidegger, there are other paramount phenomenologists. One of them is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who had grounded his epistemology in intentionality. Intentionality, or in other words, towardness. It's going towards something. It's aimed and directed towards something. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty sought to develop a discussion of embodied experience, saying that we perceive with our whole body and not just our mind. Merleau-Ponty was the one who said, quote, "I do not just know, but know something." So Merleau-Ponty was influenced also by Gabriel Marcel, who was a French existentialist, and he was the one who said, "I am my body." So Merleau-Ponty picks up his ideas, and he ties in perceiving with a human body in this experience in phenomenology, and that's very important in our study. I'm going to talk about him too. Alright, so next is Jean-Paul Sartre, and Jean-Paul Sartre is very famous. Is a very famous French existentialist. His main contribution to epistemology was to see knowledge as opposed to ignorance. And according to Sartre, ignorance is the decision to let being collapse. That was his quote. Ignorance is the decision to let being collapse, and that was a big key term in his works when he was comparing knowledge and comparing ignorance. According to Sartre, to gain knowledge meant to get out of ignorance. As a free being for itself, être pour soi, who seeks to uncover being in itself, être en soi, and so reveal the truth. And if you do recall in the previous weeks when we discussed contemporary continental philosophy, these were the two modes of being that Jean-Paul Sartre had 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 collectively had collectively thought about and put in a conceptual framework. Development and discipline. So if we think about how Husserl had first come to the study of phenomenology, we really have to understand his viewpoint and his purpose as to know the discipline better. We know that Husserl had sought to break away from Cartesian philosophy. For Descartes, as we know, reality was a separate entity. It was something that was only understood through rational terms or through processes of deduction. Recall Descartes and his cogito ergo sum. We remember that for him, it was rationality that was primary. So emotions and perceptions were not reliable according to Descartes. For Descartes, reason was solely dependable and primary. So what phenomenology does to break free from that frame of thinking is that it seeks to understand the outside world as interpreted by human consciousness in terms of how philosophers understand being and existence. Because what unifies us is a shared conception. We grasp all the events and things in the world, and they present themselves to us in an intelligible way. So for Husserl, this was something that was evident to him and important, and something that I don't want to say transcend, but something that also goes hand in hand with reason and seeing things in the world in that manner. So if we look here on this terms, the first is intentionality. That's the word that types of phenomenology. The first is realist phenomenology. And realist phenomenology studies the structure of consciousness and intentionality. The goal of realist phenomenology is the analysis of intentional structures of mental acts that is directed toward both real and ideal objects. And realist phenomenology, by the way, this was the earlier one that was developed during the time of Husserl. During that time, I have to look at my notes to make sure this time frame is right. But it was developed during that time that time frame when Husserl was writing local investigations. Around that time, this was the view of Husserl primarily. And so the second type of phenomenology is transcendental phenomenology. And this phenomenology studies how objects are constituted in pure or transcendental consciousness. So instead of the object, it takes the experience as the starting point. It takes that conscious experience, that conscious awareness as the starting point, and then works its way toward the meaning, works its way in intentionality from point A to point